I was the kind of daughter people pointed to with admiration, the straight A student, the responsible one, the golden child who never stepped out of line. My mother, Margaret, wore my achievements like a badge of honor, and my father, Richard, would smile approvingly, patting my shoulder like I was his greatest accomplishment. "That's my girl," he'd say, as if my success was just another extension of his own. I believed in everything they taught me: hard work, honesty, loyalty. Those weren't just values, they were the foundation of my life. Success came naturally to me because I followed the rules. Structure made sense, discipline led to results. That's how I built my company: calculated risks, long hours, and an unshakable belief that integrity always wins. I worked hard because I believed that's how my family had done it too. My parents had given me a home built on trust and love, or at least, that's what I told myself. But sometimes, late at night, when everything was quiet, I'd feel something gnawing at the edges of my mind, a whisper of doubt I could never quite silence. My father's voice, hushed and urgent behind the closed door of his study. The abrupt endings to phone calls when I walked into the room. The way my mother's fingers tensed around the stem of her wine glass, her smile a little too tight. I didn't have proof, just a feeling, but that feeling never left me. I tried to ignore it. Tried to convince myself I was overthinking, being paranoid, reading too much into things. But trust only works when there are no secrets. And in my family, I was starting to realize there were secrets lurking everywhere. I wanted to believe in my father. I really did. He was the kind of man people respected: charming, well-spoken, successful. He built a career on trust, on relationships, on always knowing the right thing to say. But sometimes, I wondered if that charm was just a mask, a carefully crafted performance. Because when he thought no one was watching, his expression changed. The warmth in his voice faded. There was something colder, something calculated beneath the surface. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was looking for problems where none existed. But then there were the business trips, last minute, unplanned, always with some vague excuse. And the late-night calls. I started noticing patterns. The way he'd step outside when the phone rang, the way his voice dropped to almost a whisper. My mother noticed, too. I could see it in the way her shoulders tensed when he left the room, the way her smile faltered when she thought no one was paying attention. But she never said a word. That was the strangest part, her silence. My mother wasn't weak. She was the backbone of our family, the one who held everything together. But over the years, something in her had changed. She laughed less. Drank more. Some nights I'd find her sitting alone in the dark, staring at nothing, as if trapped in a world she couldn't escape. And I started to wonder, how long had she known? How long had she been pretending everything was fine? I didn't ask her. Maybe because I wasn't ready to hear the truth. Maybe because, deep down, I was still clinging to the idea that our family was exactly what it seemed. But the cracks were already there, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore them, they were only getting wider. I used to think my father was invincible, that no matter what happened, he would always be in control, calm, confident, unshaken. But now, when I looked at him, I wasn't so sure. It was in the little things, the details I used to overlook. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes anymore. The way he checked his phone more often, his grip tightening around it like he was afraid someone might take it from him. I started paying attention. Watching him. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for at first. Proof, maybe. Or a reason to let go of the doubt that had been eating away at me. But the more I watched, the less I trusted. His absences stretched longer. The excuses became thinner. He was slipping, and he didn't even realize it. But my mother? She noticed everything. I could see it in the way she studied him when he spoke, as if trying to decipher which parts of his words were true, and which were carefully chosen lies. I saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the quiet resignation of a woman who had learned to live with disappointment. And that scared me more than anything. I told myself I wasn't going to get involved, that whatever was happening between them wasn't my battle to fight, but it wasn't that simple. because this wasn't just about them. This was about my family, the one I had spent my entire life believing in. And the more I uncovered, the more I realized I wasn't sure if I had ever really known the truth at all. Some moments in life change you forever. They creep up when you least expect them, unraveling everything you thought was certain. For me, it happened on an ordinary afternoon, in an upscale restaurant, over a business lunch that was supposed to be just another step forward in my career. I was seated at the head of the table, poised, focused, presenting my vision to a group of potential investors. The air smelled of roasted garlic and fresh basil, the low hum of conversation blending with the soft clinking of silverware against porcelain. It was the kind of setting where people shook hands over million-dollar deals, where reputations were built and broken over a single glass of wine. And then, mid-sentence, I saw him. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me. But no, it was him, my father. Sitting at a table near the window, his back straight, his expression easy, familiar. But he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a woman. She leaned in when she spoke, her manicured fingers brushing his wrist, her laughter light, intimate. The way he looked at her, it was effortless, unguarded. And suddenly I knew. The world around me faded. The voices at my table became muffled noise. The outlines of the room blurred. My body stiffened, my hands tightening into fists beneath the tablecloth. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It wasn't a whisper in the back of my mind. It was real, unfolding in front of me, like a cruel joke I had no choice but to witness. I forced myself to keep breathing, to sit still, to pretend I was still engaged in the conversation happening around me. But my heart was hammering in my chest, my throat tightening as I watched the scene play out before me. He reached across the table, fingers grazing hers in a way that was too familiar, too intimate to be mistaken for anything else. She smiled, tilting her head slightly, the kind of soft, knowing look that made my stomach turn. I had suspected for years. The late-night calls, the sudden business trips, the way my mother had grown quieter, her sadness tucked neatly behind a well-practiced smile. But seeing him with her, in broad daylight, laughing like he didn't have a wife, a daughter, a life he had vowed to protect, it was different. It was undeniable. My hand slid beneath the table, fingers gripping my phone. Every instinct in me screamed to stand up, to walk over there, to confront him in front of everyone, to make him feel the same humiliation, the same betrayal that was now searing through my veins. But I didn't. Not yet. If there was one thing my father had taught me, it was patience. You don't strike when you're angry. You wait. You plan. You make sure the knife goes deep enough that there's no coming back from it. So I stayed still. My expression didn't change. My voice didn't falter as I forced myself to refocus on the conversation at my table. But my mind was elsewhere, calculating, strategizing. He had no idea I had seen him. No idea that the daughter he had raised to be strong, to be relentless, had just become his biggest threat. I didn't hesitate. With a steady hand, I positioned my phone just below the edge of the table, angling the camera so I had a clear shot of them. I hit record. My breath was slow, controlled, even as my pulse roared in my ears. He had no idea. He was too caught up in her, too comfortable, too confident in his lies. The screen captured everything. The way he leaned in, his voice low, a murmur of words I couldn't hear but didn't need to. The way she laughed softly, her fingers trailing along the edge of her wine glass before reaching for his hand again. He didn't pull away. He welcomed it, encouraged it. I zoomed in, focusing on the way his thumb brushed over her knuckles, the way he smiled at her like she was the only woman in the world. Bile burned at the back of my throat. My father, the man who preached loyalty and honesty, who told me integrity was everything, was nothing more than a fraud. And my mother had lived with this for how long? Months? Years? Had she always known and just never had proof? Or had she chosen to look away? To pretend? No, I wouldn't pretend. I wouldn't look away. I ended the recording and placed my phone face down on the table, my fingers pressing into the cool linen as I forced myself to stay composed. This wasn't just about anger anymore. It wasn't just about disappointment. This was war, and I was going to make sure my father lost everything. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the video playing over and over in my mind. His smile, her touch, the ease with which he betrayed us. It wasn't just the act, it was the arrogance, the certainty that he would never get caught, that he could live 2 lives without consequence. But he was wrong. By morning, I had a plan. The video was only the beginning. If I was going to destroy him, I needed more. I spent hours digging, combing through financial records, emails, anything that might reveal how deep his deception ran. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There were hidden transactions, money transferred to an account my mother had never seen, hotel bookings in cities he wasn't supposed to be in, expensive jewelry, designer clothes, gifts he never brought home. My hands shook as I scrolled through the evidence, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. This wasn't just about proving he was unfaithful. It was about making sure he had nowhere to hide. He thought he was untouchable, that he had covered his tracks, but he had underestimated me, and that was his first mistake. I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table, my phone resting between us like a loaded weapon. The morning sun streamed through the windows, casting a warm glow on her tired face. She looked at me with quiet concern, her fingers curled around a steaming cup of coffee, unaware that in the next few moments, her entire world was about to change. "I need to show you something," I said, my voice steady, but my hands weren't. She frowned but nodded, setting her cup down. I turned my phone around and pressed play. She didn't react at first. Her eyes stayed locked on the screen, watching as the man she had built a life with held another woman's hand, whispered something in her ear, smiled like he was in love. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the video. When it ended, I looked up, expecting tears, a breakdown, something. But she just sat there, completely still. Then slowly, she exhaled, a long, measured breath. And when she finally lifted her gaze to mine, something had shifted. The sadness was still there, but beneath it, something stronger, sharper. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Yesterday," I admitted, "but I've suspected for years." She nodded, as if that confirmed something she had always known, but never said aloud. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the table, knuckles white. Then, for the first time in my life, I saw it. Anger. Cold, quiet, unshakable anger. "We're not going to cry about this," she said, her voice firm. "We're going to destroy him." And just like that, the war had begun. Something in her had changed. The woman sitting across from me wasn't the quiet, patient wife who had spent years swallowing her pain. No, this was someone new, someone dangerous. And for the first time, I saw the fire that my father had spent decades trying to smother. She straightened in her chair, rolling her shoulders back like a queen reclaiming her throne. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice even. "I want to know exactly what he's done." I laid it all out. The hidden transactions, the secret hotel stays, the gifts. Every single piece of evidence I had gathered in just 24 hours. She listened without blinking, without interrupting, absorbing every detail like a strategist preparing for battle. When I was done, she nodded once. "Good. We're going to hit him where it hurts." I leaned forward, my pulse quickening. "How?" Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We take away everything he cares about. His reputation, his money, his security." She picked up my phone, scrolling through the evidence as if calculating her next move. "And we make sure he never sees it coming." A thrill ran through me. She wasn't broken. She wasn't defeated. She was ready to burn it all down, and I was going to help her do it. Revenge, when done right, is an art. It requires patience, precision, and the perfect moment to strike. And my mother, Margaret, was about to paint her masterpiece. We spent days planning, making sure every detail was airtight. The evidence wasn't just enough to expose him, it was enough to ruin him. And the best part? He had no idea. It started with a carefully leaked video. Not to the family, not to close friends, but to the one thing my father valued more than anything, his professional circle. The people who built him up, who trusted him, who saw him as an honorable businessman. The whispers spread like wildfire. The scandal unfolded before he could even react. By the time he realized what was happening, the damage was irreversible. Business partners distanced themselves. Friends stopped returning calls. The same people who once admired him now looked at him with disgust. His carefully curated image was crumbling, and for the first time, Richard Kingston, the man who always had the upper hand, was completely powerless, and we weren't even finished yet. The moment he walked through the front door, I knew he had seen it. His face was flushed, his tie loosened, his breath uneven. He looked at my mother, then at me, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. "Margaret," he started, voice low, careful. "Whatever you think you—" She slid a thick envelope across the table. "Save it." He hesitated before picking it up. His fingers trembled as he pulled out the divorce papers, his name printed in bold letters at the top. But that wasn't what made him pale. It was the attachments, the bank statements, the hotel records, the proof of his betrayal laid out in black and white. My mother had been meticulous. Every expense, every transaction, every lie he had ever told was neatly documented, impossible to refute. "You're making a mistake," he said, but the confidence was gone. My mother smiled, slow, deliberate. "No, Richard, you did." The terms were brutal, full financial disclosure. The house, the cars, the investments, hers. Half of his business, hers. Alimony, lifelong. He had built his empire believing he was untouchable. But in his arrogance, he had overlooked one simple truth. The woman standing in front of him was smarter, stronger, and far more ruthless than he had ever given her credit for. "I won't sign this," he spat, slamming the papers on the table. "You will," I said, meeting his glare. "Because if you don't, we take this to court. And trust me, the evidence we have, you won't just lose your money, you'll lose everything." For the first time, Richard Kingston had no way out. Richard was a proud man. He had built his life on control, controlling his career, his reputation, his family. But standing there, gripping the divorce papers with white-knuckled hands, he was a man unraveling. His power, his security, his carefully constructed world, it was slipping through his fingers, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do about it. But the final blow wasn't ours to deliver. It came from the woman he had risked everything for. She called him the next day, and I knew the second I heard his voice that she had seen the news. The exposure, the financial ruin, the loss of his standing, none of it was a secret anymore. His disgrace was public, and she wasn't about to stick around for the fallout. I stood by the doorway listening as he tried to reason with her, to assure her that things would be fine, that he would fix this, but I knew better. I could practically hear her disgust through the phone. Whatever illusion she had built of him, the wealthy, powerful man who could give her the world, was shattered. He wasn't her ticket to a better life anymore. He was a liability. And she didn't love him enough to go down with him. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. His jaw was clenched so tightly I thought he might break his teeth. "She left, didn't she?" I asked, my voice calm. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. I already knew. Now he had nothing. No money, no power, no mistress, no family. And the best part, he had done it to himself. There was a time when my father walked into a room and commanded respect. When his name carried weight, when people listened, when they cared. But now he was nothing more than a disgraced man clawing at the remnants of a life he had so carelessly thrown away. His business partners severed ties. Clients pulled their contracts. The whispers that once carried admiration now dripped with contempt. Richard Kingston, the man who lost everything, the cheater, the fraud, he wasn't just ruined, he was erased. I heard through mutual contacts that he had moved into a small rental on the outskirts of town, a far cry from the estate he once owned, from the luxury he had surrounded himself with. No more lavish dinners, no more tailored suits, just a man reduced to the consequences of his own arrogance. And the most satisfying part? He had no one to blame but himself. If my father's downfall was slow and merciless, my mother's rise was nothing short of triumphant. For the first time in years, I saw her breathe, really breathe, without the weight of betrayal pressing down on her. She carried herself differently now, lighter, freer, like she had shed an invisible chain that had been wrapped around her for decades. She kept the house, of course. Why should she be the one to leave? The walls that once held quiet misery now echoed with warmth. She redecorated, got rid of every trace of him, new furniture, fresh paint, a garden in the backyard she always said she never had time for. And then, one night over dinner, she smiled at me, a real, genuine smile, and said, "I met someone." I almost choked on my wine. Not because I was surprised. She was beautiful, intelligent, and strong. Any man would be lucky to have her. But because I had spent so long seeing her as his wife, as someone who had sacrificed her happiness for a man who didn't deserve her, that I had almost forgotten she was still her own person. And the best part? She didn't need him. She never had. The night felt different, lighter. There was no tension, no forced smiles, no underlying sadness lurking beneath the surface. My mother and I sat across from each other at our favorite restaurant, the same place where just weeks ago I had seen my father with his mistress. But tonight the air was filled with something new, relief, victory. We toasted to the future, to new beginnings, to a life without Richard. My mother laughed, really laughed, and for the first time, I saw her not just as the woman who had suffered, but as the woman who had survived, the woman who had won. And then, my phone vibrated. I didn't have to look. I already knew who it was. Still, I reached for it, flipping it over to confirm what I already suspected. Richard Kingston. A single text. "Olivia, please, just talk to me." I stared at the words, waiting for some kind of reaction. Anger, pity, regret. But I felt nothing. Nothing at all. Without a second thought, I deleted the message. Then, with quiet finality, I blocked his number. I set my phone down, picked up my glass, and met my mother's gaze. "So," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips, "tell me more about this guy you met." And just like that, the past was behind us.